In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion against Ukraine. However, Ukraine is just the latest victim of Russia's unwarranted 21st century aggression, which is the latest of 3 full-scale invasions. From 1999 to 2000, for the second time in less than a decade, Russia invaded the country of Chechnya. The Chechens were a small population that had been oppressed for decades under Stalin's brutal regime, which in 1944 went so far as to deport nearly 408,000 Chechens and 92,000 Ingush to the middle of nowhere in Kazakhstan. Stalin justified this by claiming that the Chechens were supporting and sympathizing with the Nazis, even though he was likely just targeting the Muslim majority of the region, especially since over 40,000 Chechens were fighting for the Soviets on the front line. He also dismantled the Chechen Ingush Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, or ASSR, and turned it into the Grozny Oblast, directly incorporating it with the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, or SFSR. The harsh conditions of the exile resulted in the deaths of nearly 200,000 Chechens and Ingush, about a third of their entire population. After they were deported, the area was resettled with ethnic Russians. Russian became the official language and main ethnicity, while everything Chechen, including the language, was completely outlawed. The Chechens were only allowed to return in 1953 after the death of Stalin due to the then President Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinization. The return wasn't bloodless, though. As soon as the Chechens returned, massive protests and riots were carried out by the ethnic Russians, while extreme discrimination remained legal. 5 years later, the Chechen Ingush ASSR was restored, angering much of the Russian population of Chechnya even more. Unfortunately, there isn't enough time to do justice to the horrors that took place back during Stalin's Operation Lentil, but this is still important as it helps to add context to the civil unrest in Chechnya. I'm also going to go into this in detail, as the parallels with Ukraine are uncanny to say the least, and describe Putin's mind very well. Just to clarify, Putin only led the second invasion, while Yeltsin led the first. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Dudayev seized and slowly turned unrecognized Chechnya into a dictatorship. Opposition groups slowly turned into full-scale armed rebellions, which in turn led to Dudayev sending tanks to crush them. Simply put, things were going very badly inside of Chechnya. Things got even worse in 1994 when Russia began a blockade across its entire border with Chechnya, while sending money, weapons, and troops to support the Chechen rebels revolting against Dudayev. The majority of Dudayev's opponents still preferred him even over Yeltsin and his Russian state, which led many of the mercenaries to be killed after 2 small attacks on Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. Around 70 of them were even kept hostage. After Yeltsin sent an ultimatum to Chechnya to release all the hostages, which was unsuccessful, he began to draw war plans. He was so enthusiastic that he gave the military only 14 days to prepare for the entire invasion. This is just one example of the unilateral power of Russian presidents. Here we can see the divide in Russia, which also happened and is still happening now from the invasion of Ukraine. Back in 1994, over 500 Russian officers were demoted for refusing to invade, while the Deputy Minister of Defense resigned. This almost parallels with Ukraine, except this time thousands of troops are fighting to fight against their Slavic brethren. From the very beginning, both the war against Chechnya and Ukraine were incredibly unpopular inside of Russia. Yeltsin's yes man, Grachev, ambitiously promised that Chechnya would fall in hours. He planned to bomb every part of the country using planes, and then use tanks to blitzkrieg 3 sides of Chechnya simultaneously, heading straight to Grozny. His plan was intended to minimize bloodshed and prevent heavy warfare. This failed. You see, there's something that you have to understand about Chechnya. It's very hilly. These mountains are obviously very difficult to move through, but gave the Chechens, who were very well armed and motivated, ample locations to hide and ambush the Russian tanks. Very quickly, the overconfident and underprepared Russians found themselves being destroyed by the Chechens. All opposition groups to Dudayev found themselves fighting the Russians, and thousands of civilians fought alongside them. The Chechen forces weren't connected at all, but were still able to spread out and destroy the Russians. One of the Chechens' favorite tactics was to locate 2 Russian groups, shoot at both of them, and watch the friendly fire ensue. Besides terrain, another major advantage in both wars was language, as nearly all Chechens spoke Russian, but no Russians spoke Chechen. This meant that Chechnya could tap into Russian communications, as they used to be a Russian republic and had access to this. Most of the Chechen army was also trained by Russians. Altogether, the Chechens knew the Russian strategies and were easily able to impersonate them and confuse them. For the sake of time, we'll skip to the end of the first invasion. In total, the Chechens had about 3,000 casualties, while the Russians suffered nearly 50,000. Over 100,000 Chechen civilians were killed. After the Chechens retook Grozny, the Abkhazia Accords were signed. Crucially, the accord stated that Russia didn't have to recognize the Chechen Republic of Chechnya until late 2001. This was a deadline. In September of 1999, Chechen terrorists bombed apartments in Banaysk, Moscow, and Volgodonsk, killing over 300 people, while more troops invaded Dagestan. The Russians were quick to respond, and on the 1st of October, under the orders of Vladimir Putin, 80,000 Russian troops moved into Chechnya for the second time in less than a decade. Azmakashadov, the then president of Chechnya, asked for help from both Russia and NATO to crack down on the warlord terrorists who had invaded Russia. But this was denied and ignored by both parties. In the first 4 days of the war, the Russians advanced all the way to the Terek River. A week later, they crossed the river and began an advance to Grozny, which they reached in December. Once the capital was taken in early February, the battle for the mountains began. This final phase of the war saw fighting throughout the mountains. Within 2 months, despite the harsh Chechen resistance, the Russians were ultimately victorious. In the following month of May, Chechnya was annexed into Russia, and Imad Kadyrov was placed in charge. Although he was assassinated by Chechen separatists in 2004, his son still rules today. Although the war was over, insurgency remained a problem, taking hundreds of lives until 2009. Something important to note is how the war started. In both invasions of Chechnya and the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Russia first launched an extensive air campaign and used similar strategies. This war was also less deadly than the previous. Still though, over 80,000 people were either killed, injured, or went missing, about half that of the first invasion. Just 8 years later, in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, guaranteeing the survival of the small breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Before you start worrying, no, Russia did not invade the United States through nearly 9,000 kilometers of sea. Instead, this was the first conflict in Europe during the 21st century, in a small country in the Caucasus. This conflict dates back a while, and I've already made a video very quickly summarizing it, however, I'll go into more detail this time. Before the Soviet Union split up, the Georgian SSR was home to 2 ASSRs and 1 AO. Abkhazia and Adjaria were both ASSRs, and South Ossetia was an autonomous oblast, or an AO. These were autonomous from Georgia, mostly due to their ethnicity, which were the Circassians under Abkhazia and the Indo-Europeans under North and South Ossetia. The Adjarians, however, were ethnically Georgian, but like the Abkhazians, they're Muslim, whereas the rest of Georgia is Eastern Orthodox. 3 months before the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, a full-scale war broke out between South Ossetia and Georgia, and the next year with Abkhazia. The end result came with both of them being de facto independent, but not controlling all of their territory. Between the years of 1992 and 2008, Russia and Georgia had high tensions. This eliminated all trade between the two, which had virtually no effect on Russia, but devastated the much smaller Georgia. Roadblocks and armed militias were also set up on the border of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which were also patrolled by a UN peacekeeping force. The president, Edward Shevardnadze, was forced to leave office during the Rose Revolution, where thousands of people protested against the ceasefire. In 2008, another war began, but how it started is up for interpretation. According to the Georgians, Russia had sent troops to Shinzlitsky, the capital of South Ossetia. But according to the Russians, the Georgians marched with tanks in an attempt to take Shinzlitsky, but there were no Russian troops there. In total, Russia mobilized over 70,000 troops in South Ossetia alone, which had over 3,000 troops themselves, against the entire Georgian army of just 11,000. Although Georgia's army was small, they weren't alone, as they had non-direct assistance from many different countries, especially the United States. This was mostly because over 2,000 Georgian troops were stationed in Baghdad, Iraq, assisting the United States. This small alliance would play a big role in helping keep the peace deal at the end of the war. At the beginning of the war, Georgia quickly captured Chernivtsi. A few days later, Russia and South Ossetia had managed to capture the rest of South Ossetia and pushed all the way to Gori, a city just 40 miles from the Georgian capital of Tbilisi. Around the same time, on the western side of Georgia, Russia opened up a second front, capturing the Georgian-held Kaduri Gorge. They also started a blockade on Georgia's eastern coast, using the Black Sea Fleet for the first time since 1945, blocking off the strategically important city of Poti, which they took just a few days later. After 16 days, a ceasefire went into effect, ending the war. The boundaries were redrawn to the claimed areas of both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. During the war, 192,000 Georgians were displaced, and today that number is still around 20,000. This war also led to the formal recognition of both Abkhazia and South Ossetia by the Russian Federation, which still stations troops there as a launching point for another possible invasion in the future. In total, there were about 1,000 casualties during the 16-day war. However, over 230,000 people were displaced from their homes in total. I'm not going to be talking about Ukraine or Crimea today, since I'm going to be releasing an extensive video on the history and rationale in a month or two. Thanks for watching. Bye.